Some ways to go are worse than others, and getting crushed is especially scary and horrible. I think it's safe to say that given the choice, getting crushed would be low on our list of ideal ways to go out. So you wouldn't think anyone would choose to get crushed. But despite the witch accusations and the trouble he was in, our guy today kinda did. Even though the alternative was nowhere near as bad, if still pretty bad. This is the story of how gross it is to get crushed on purpose. Viewer discretion is advised. By 1662, Giles Corey was in his 70s. If you've seen Arthur Miller's play The Crucible, you might know of Giles. According to Miller, Giles was a hero who died standing up to the corruption in the Salem Witch Trials while defending his wife. But the truth is, Giles was a bit of a jerk. He moved to America sometime before 1640 and spent quite a while living in Salem town before moving to Salem village. He couldn't keep out of trouble, getting arrested for petty crimes and misdemeanours, and the people who knew him called him a quarrelsome and contentious bad neighbour. It wasn't just minor crimes. In 1676, he took a stick to one of his farm workers, Jacob Goodale, and refused to send him for medical help until 10 days later. Luckily for Giles, if not for Jacob, the farm owners were free to harm their indentured servants, so he got away with a charge of unreasonable force and a fine. He also tried to burn one of his neighbour's barns down. Allegedly. Sometime in February 1692, Giles would have heard about the strange things that had been happening to two girls in the village, 9-year-old Betty Parris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams. They were the daughter and niece of Salem's minister, and out of nowhere they started having seizures. It's often assumed that people back then were medically backward, and well, they were, but they knew some diseases caused seizures, like epilepsy. But this was different. The minister from a nearby town called them beyond the power of epileptic fits or natural disease. It wasn't just contortions either. They complained of being pricked and of feeling like something was pinching them. They would scream at people, throw things around the room, scramble on the furniture and scream out in church. Pretty much what Reagan does in The Exorcist, minus the 360-degree head spin. The behaviour spread to two more girls, 12-year-old Ann Putnam Jr. and 17-year-old Elizabeth Hubbard. The local doctor couldn't find anything physically wrong with them. So back in the 1700s, there was only one explanation for that: witchcraft. Much of Europe and its colonies became paranoid about witches during the 16th and 17th centuries. I won't go into too much detail now, that's a whole video by itself. Let me know in the comments if you like a video on why the Witch Crazes were an abomination, literally, assuming this isn't the future and I've already made it, in which case check out the link at the end. What's important to know for now is that the world changed so much and so fast that most people living at the time were terrified that the end times had come. They were sure the devil and his soldiers were on their way to bring Armageddon, and witches were the first wave of attacks. 80% of witches in most of Europe were women. That's for a few reasons. For a start, they thought women were wetter than colder than men. Stay with me. People thought that humans were filled with 4 chemicals. Yellow bile that comes out of vomit, black bile that comes out as excrement, phlegm, which is, well, phlegm, and sanguine, or blood. Our health was directly linked to those chemicals. If they became unbalanced or mixed into strange concoctions, that would make us sick. But they didn't just think they controlled our health, they also controlled how people behaved. It was genuinely thought that women were more likely to get an excess of sanguine and phlegm than men, especially down there. They also believed that sanguine, because blood is warm, kept the body warm. If you lose it, like many women do every month or so, you'll get cold. So, the only way a woman could get her warmth back was to get close to a man. As close as possible. And, they thought, the devil knew that women were up for it most of the time and would use that to manipulate them in a way they couldn't manipulate a man. They also believed, in these far from enlightened times, that women were more emotional. partly because humans were also associated with the passions, but also because they genuinely thought women were no more developed than boys, while men were made different, designed to reason and be closer to God. By the 1690s, the witch crazes that rocked Europe had started to calm down, but in Salem, Massachusetts, like many of the areas colonised by Europeans, things were still a little backward. It was an area settled by deeply faithful people, what we now might call fundamentalist Puritans. They believed, and they believed hard. And it wasn't just a simple belief shared by peasants and the uneducated. For example, Increase Mather was extremely well read. He'd gone to Harvard, Trinity College Island, and was one of the people who got Massachusetts its charter. Even so, he and his even better educated son Cotton firmly believed in witchcraft. They even wrote books about it. So, when the young girls began to point fingers at people for being witches, people believed them. Giles heard about the first 3 women to go on trial and might have thought it was safe because, as I said, most of the time witches were women. And that was the case here too. Of the 139 accused, only 37 were men, and only 5 of the 19 who became unalive were men. This story is not here, by the way, to forget the many women who were victims of this tragedy, or the witch crazes in general. But what happened to Giles didn't happen to them. When a man was accused, it was usually because they'd stood up for a woman or treated a woman badly enough that they ended up getting charged themselves by one of those women at the trial. All the girls that were making accusations had a bone to pick with Giles. Giles first got dragged into the mess when his wife Martha was accused. Now, Martha was a pretty controversial person in the village by herself. Like her husband, she'd been involved in petty theft, and she'd also been nearly sent down for taking the life of an enslaved boy. They had a lot in common. What they didn't have in common was Martha's daughter, Benoni. Giles never knew who Benoni's father was. It was either an African slave or a Native American man, and the arrangement in the household did raise eyebrows in the village. So, you might think it was easy for people to believe Martha was a witch, but Martha had turned a corner. She regularly went to church, she lived piously, more pious than most in fact, and seemed deeply repentant. So, it was a shock. But Martha had openly said the witch trial was a sham and that the girls were lying. That's what got her accused. And by the way, Arthur Miller chose to give her words to her husband in The Crucible. Arthur Miller doesn't even have Martha in the play apart from a voice off stage. Miller also has Giles sticking up for his wife and challenging the court so hard that they arrested him for contempt. But that's not what happened. At first, Giles believed the hype about his wife. On March 24th, he told the court she'd done a range of evil things, from casting spells on him, to stopping him from praying, to making his oxen ill. Then, on April 19th, he changed his mind. Possibly because on the day before, a warrant had been issued for his arrest. The girls had used the cruelty he'd shown them as the basis of a fictional story about how he got angry with them and they wouldn't take the devil's sacrament. He went back on what he'd said about his wife, but this only made life worse for Martha as the court started to think she put him under a new spell. They took him from the court and threw him in jail with his wife, where things were probably a little tense. Then, on September the 16th, he was taken to trial. He pleaded not guilty, but more than that, he refused to be put on trial at all, preferring to stand mute, as it was known. Giles knew he had no hope of winning, and to be found guilty would, in the very best case scenario, mean he'd lose all his farmland. In the worst case, he'd lose his life. As a side note, Massachusetts was still operating on the reversion of English law. In England, witches were never burned, they were hung. The reasons are complicated, and I'll tell you why more in the video you're either going to ask me to do in the comments, or the one you're going to watch after this because it's now the future. It wasn't long before Giles found out that being hanged might not be such a bad option after all, because after he decided to keep stum, the court ordered him to undergo peine forte et dure, or hard and forceful punishment. Hard and forceful is an understatement. On September 18th, he was led from the jail to the field outside. Then he was stripped of all his clothes except his underwear, tied to a wooden board, and a second board was placed on top of him. Then heavy boulders were added, one by one. After each, there'd be a pause so Giles could become unmute and give testimony. But he stayed silent. So, another boulder was added. The first thing he would have felt was the agony of his muscles dying as his veins got trapped under the weight, stopping waste blood from leaving. The next sensation he would have had would be the most reported symptom right before crush syndrome kicked in, extreme thirst. Now, crush syndrome is what would have been happening to Giles as his muscles began to break up. Myoglobin, the protein that acts as an oxygen reserve in your muscles, would have come loose, and any of that got into his bloodstream would have collected in the kidneys, eventually shutting them down. Sometimes this happens hours after the crush itself. Doctors even call it the smiling disease, because people are smiling because they've survived when it kicks in and takes them. As more weight was added, the walls of his cell would have started to rupture in a process called lysis. The ruptured cell water is what causes the extreme dehydration. The body would try to get rid of all that extra liquid flowing from the damaged cells using sweat and other routes. Not to put too fine a point on it, he likely relieved himself. I know I would have. Once his body was dehydrated, the toxins gathering in Giles' kidneys had no other way out. That would have put him into a state of shock, making it almost impossible for Giles to give evidence even if he wanted to. The Inquisitors wouldn't have known this back then. They'd have assumed he was staying silent and just added more weight. But he did say one more thing. After being asked to confess one last time, and while in unbearable pain, Giles is said to have shouted, "More weight!" They did as he asked. At that point, his lungs would have stopped working, possibly liquefying, and there'd be no oxygen travelling around his body. Not that it could travel if it wanted to. It's likely that his cardiovascular system would have also collapsed, and the potassium in his body, released when his cell membranes burst, would have caused cardiac arrest in what was left of his heart. At that point, Giles passed out. Then he passed on. He is the only person who has ever been crushed to death by order of a court in North America. A grieving Martha lost her life the traditional way on September 22nd. Thank you for spending time with historical horror in our first video. If you liked it, there is something you can click round here to prove it. And it'd be far from horrific if you'd hit that sub button to get more gross and terrifying stories from history every Wednesday and Sunday. Do let me know if you'd like that video about why the witch trials were an abomination, or if you'd like more videos covering the ways to go that most would rather avoid. But most of all, people, stay gross. Gross is good.